everybody, and welcome to another episode of Adventures with Andi. I cannot believe that I completely forgot to show you the yarn mop from our Verdigrish yarn. I meant to. That's why I showed, went ahead and filmed dyeing it when I was filming the Verdigrish yarn. I had the finished skein hanging up right here because this on my desk. Ignore the mess. This is where I film the conclusions. So I had the skein hanging up right here off one of these so that it'd be right there in my face. And when I finish talking about the Verdigrish yarn, I would be able to just grab the yarn mop and show you it alongside with the Verdigrish yarn. And yet I still somehow managed to completely forget. And those of you who know me are not at all surprised about this, because as I frequently say, my memory is like a sieve, full of holes, retains very little. Anyway, I did actually dye that yarn mop, so for this episode, I'm going to show you how it turned out. But in case you have forgotten what we did in dyeing the Verdigrish yarn that led to our yarn mop, if like me, you have slept since then, so you have forgotten, or if you just haven't seen that video yet, I thought we'd do a quick recap of what we did in dyeing the Verdigrish yarn. But instead of me just talking about it, because you listen to me all the time, I thought it'd be fun to let Chad do the recap voiceover. So I will go ahead and turn it over to him and let him run you through what we did in dyeing the Verdigrish yarn mop, what was done to the, and what we did in dyeing the Verdigrish yarn, what was done to the yarn mop during the course of dyeing the Verdigrish yarn. And then I will show you the actual footage of the final dyeing of the yarn mop, when it went from being just a yarn mop to let's put the color on here. And then I'll show you the resulting skein. So without further ado, take it away, Chad.
Previously on Adventures with Andi, Andi glazed some she glazed some yarn. She decided that she was going to do a verdigris color, and so she took some Wilton's copper and some Wilton's Kelly green. The copper she pre-mixed, having learned from previous videos that it takes a long time to actually mix up the dye. With her trusty crock pot at hand, Andi added her mixed up copper dye. That was going to form the basis of the verdigris glazed yarn. She mixed it well, adding it slowly and agitating the water to ensure that she did receive a thorough mixing of the copper dye so that the yarn would have plenty to take up. Look at it spin. That's some bubbles. Oh, I guess that was some bubbles. She added the copper dye really well, mixed it up to ensure that there were no clumps left. The yarn was soaked in water and vinegar, not one to let good dye go to waste. Andi had a yarn mop close at hand. After adding the copper dye to her crock pot, she used the yarn mop to not only wipe off the outside of the mason jar, but also the inside and the table that she had splashed silly with copper dye while mixing it up. The main skein was allowed to soak overnight, and in the morning, Andi checked to see how much dye had been absorbed. Not as much as she had hoped. And still, the skein was slightly orange, so she mixed up more copper dye and added it to the crock pot and allowed it to soak longer to hopefully deepen the copper color. The water was cold. She had not applied any heat to it yet. The yarn mop got excited for a moment, thinking its time had come, but no, it was being used to wipe a jar. She chose to allow it to soak in cold water for so long because she wanted it to absorb and take up the copper color as evenly as possible across the entire skein, as opposed to striking fast in certain spots. This main skein remained in cold water for another 24 hours, bringing the grand total to somewhere between 36 and 48 hours in the cold bath. While the primary skein soaked in the copper, the yarn mop eagerly awaited its turn in the wings. It knew its day would come. When the next morning arrived, the yarn mop was sad. There was still some yellow in the dye bath, but Andi was happy with the copper color that had been achieved. While the copper dye sets, the yarn mop steams, not in heat, but in anger, because it has not been used in a while. Vinegar was added to the dye bath, but just to help the yarn take up the remaining dye in the bath and help it strike to the yarn and set. Because not only do you need dye to have color set to animal fiber yarn, but you must also have an acid and heat. Andi mixed the water back and forth to ensure that the vinegar was well mixed and distributed throughout the entire crock pot to prevent the color from pooling when it struck. She used a technique developed by the Ancient Helvetians, where you poke the yarn over and over with a measuring spoon. With the addition of the vinegar, the yarn did rather quickly soak up more of the copper dye. At this point, the third and a critical component to the yarn dyeing process is added. Heat, added by way of her trusty crock pot. Once heat had been applied to the yarn soaking in the bath with the vinegar, it absorbed most of the rest of the dye and the water was clear. A glorious day was had by all except the yarn mop, who was like, "There's nothing left for me." It is at this point that Andi attempted the glazing. Being the careful person that she is, she did check the pH to make sure the pH was neither too high, which made it be too basic, nor too low, which could damage the fibers. Happy with a 3.4, Andi prepared to glaze. In went the green. She swirled it around. She did clean the mason jar with the yarn mop, giving it a purpose. She cleaned the lid of the mason jar, she wiped the desk, no dye was wasted. She stored the yarn mop in the mason jar so that it could absorb any extra green that might have been left. She allowed the water to warm up so that it was high, so that the heat was increased in the water to ensure it was nice and hot, because she needed high heat, she needed acid, and she needed to do this quickly and make a mess so that she could pull the yarn mop out and clean up more. Apparently a production assistant wanted her to use the mixer. We're not sure which one. Could have been the octopus. She dipped very quickly the copper dye into the hot acidic water and allowed it to remain in there for merely 5 seconds. Interestingly, it looked very green when she pulled it out. The second dip was for another 5 seconds. She noticed that there were some places in the skein where the copper still showed through very strongly. So she dipped it a third time. The third dip was for another 5 seconds, making the yarn wonder, why are we doing this? Where is my large automobile? Where is my fancy home? And then came to the conclusion that it was yarn, so it was just happy to be dyed. Cautiously optimistic with how the glazing turned out, Andi set that yarn aside and turned her attention to the yarn mop. As Andi prepared the yarn mop, the green dye said, "Come to me." Andi made sure to even wipe the sides of the crock pot where some of the green dye had pooled from the closing and opening of the lid. But then she added the yarn mop to the dye, and the yarn mop was happy. But then darkness consumed the world and all faded to black.
Wow. That got dark real fast.
It got dark real fast. Yes, it faded to black in the matter of seconds. Just yarn mop's there. 3 seconds later, it's gone. Everything is black.
Okay. Thank you, Chad.
Bye, yarn mop.
That was an epic story.
Bye, yarn mop. I shall miss you.
Don't worry, folks. I promise this does not end in sadness and tears for our intrepid hero, the yarn mop. Let's go ahead and rewind just a little bit, and I'll show you what happened. I'm just kind of dipping the yarn in and out of the dye bath here. Not really dip dyeing it, just kind of dipping it in and out of the dye bath. Let's see how much color we have left. Yeah, we got a fair bit of color still in there. So I'm gonna let our yarn mop sit in there for a while, see if it can soak up all the rest of that dye so that we have a clear dye bath, or I can just put no dye in there. And then we will go ahead and set the yarn on set the dye on our yarn. So we'll be back. So here at last, finally, is our yarn mop. And it turned out a really pretty green. Very much a Kelly green. That's what Chad says as soon as he saw it. He's like, oh, that is very Kelly green. And it turned out really nice. We do have these little bits of, it's from the orange dye, but really when you get up close on it, it doesn't actually look so much orange as it looks sort of faintly red, which I found very interesting. But the color green is really pretty. It's got some sections that have a really nice sort of blue tone to it. Still green, but much lighter and much more blue. That's probably a result, potentially a result of me doing a lackluster attempt of dip dyeing it. I could have done much more with that if I'd been more patient, but I really hadn't planned to dip dye it, so it is what it is, I guess. We also have some sections like right here where it's a much deeper green. So all in all, it's really, really pretty. I really like this color. And of course, I'm gonna move this up here. Our mini swatch for our mini skein. And you can see where those sections that look, kind of red, you can see where they show up here. I mean, so we got quite a few of them, and it's a very kind of interesting look. It's subtle with the red, but definitely there. So I kind of like that. And even just the green sections, we get that nice tonal of the different color gradations from the more green down to the very pale blue. So it gives it some interest and some life to it instead of just a flat, solid green, which is good too. You know, the whole reason I dyed the Verdigrish yarn was trying to get a solid. So there are definitely times you want that, but if you want something that's, you know, got a little bit more interest and life to it, a tonal like this really is really kind of cool. I actually just got back in from checking the mail, and if you remember how I mentioned in the Verdigrish color about how there's a construction down at the end of our street, and the rain washes the red clay from that down through the ditches, and then when it's gone, you've got that green grass with just the streaks of the red clay in it. Seriously, this is exactly what it looks like, only, you know, much more of a reddish orange there. I was like, yes, that is the yarn mop. When I got down to the ditch, it is the yarn mop. So yeah, I really like how this turned out. It's very, very nice. I have absolutely no idea what to call this one. It's definitely a Kelly green. So I don't know, maybe something Irish. It's definitely not verdigris by any stretch of the imagination. I was kind of toying with the idea of maybe calling it Copper Lost, because you get the little pops of the red in there and among the green, so it's more of a green with a bit of the red. But I'm not sure that's quite right for it either. So I don't know. I will have to think about it. But yes, the verdigris one, I did end up deciding to call it Verdigrish because it's kind of verdigris-ish. So anyway, I apologize again for completely spacing out on showing you the yarn mop in that video. I will try to do better in the future, but as I said, my memory is like a sieve, full of holes and retains very little. So odds are I will forget again at some point. But that just means you get an extra video. Alright, so be sure to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you on our next adventure. Bye!